Imagine standing in the aftermath of the most catastrophic event our planet has ever witnessed. The air is thick with ash. The oceans are acidic, and 95% of all life has been completely obliterated. This isn't science fiction. This actually happened 250 million years ago, marking the end of what we call the Permian period. But here's where things get absolutely fascinating. From this desolate wasteland, from this post-apocalyptic nightmare, something extraordinary began to emerge. The survivors didn't just rebuild the world, they transformed it into something entirely new, setting the stage for the rise of the most iconic creatures our planet has ever known. Welcome to the Triassic period, a time when Earth was quite literally starting over from scratch. But this wasn't just any ordinary recovery story. This was the dawn of the age of dinosaurs, the birth of modern ecosystems, and the beginning of a world that would look surprisingly familiar to us today. Over the next 50 million years, life would evolve in ways that seem almost impossible to believe. Giant predators would stalk the land while bizarre marine reptiles dominated the seas. The first mammals would emerge alongside flying reptiles that ruled the skies. And through it all, our planet itself would undergo dramatic changes that would reshape the very geography we know today. But before we dive into this incredible story of recovery and revolution, let me paint you a picture of just how devastated our world actually was at the start of the Triassic. The Great Dying, as scientists call it, had wiped out entire ecosystems. Coral reefs had vanished. Vast forests had turned to dust. The oceans had become toxic wastelands where almost nothing could survive. This wasn't just an extinction event. This was the closest our planet has ever come to becoming completely lifeless. Yet, from this seemingly hopeless beginning, the Triassic would become one of the most innovative periods in Earth's entire history. The empty niches left behind by the extinction created opportunities for entirely new forms of life to evolve and thrive. It was as if nature had been given a blank canvas and decided to paint something completely revolutionary. The world that emerged during the Triassic was unlike anything that had existed before. All of Earth's continents were still locked together in a massive supercontinent called Pangaea, stretching from pole to pole like a giant scar across our planet's surface. This enormous landmass created extreme weather patterns that would challenge life in ways never seen before. Some regions became scorching deserts where temperatures soared beyond anything we experience today. Other areas were drenched by massive monsoon systems that could flood entire landscapes for months at a time. The climate during the early Triassic was absolutely brutal. Scientists estimate that ocean temperatures in some areas reached 38 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to kill most marine life we know today. The poles were completely ice-free, and even in winter, temperatures remained warm enough to support tropical vegetation. This greenhouse world created by the aftermath of the Great Dying would persist for millions of years, fundamentally shaping how life would evolve and adapt. But here's what makes the Triassic so remarkable. Despite these harsh conditions, life didn't just survive. It exploded into new forms that would dominate our planet for the next 185 million years. The first dinosaurs appeared during this time, though they were nothing like the massive creatures we typically imagine. These early dinosaurs were small, agile predators that walked on two legs and possessed razor-sharp teeth and claws. They shared their world with an incredible array of other creatures, many of which seem almost alien to us today. The oceans, slowly recovering from their toxic state, became home to some of the most bizarre marine reptiles ever to exist. Imagine creatures with necks longer than their entire bodies, able to strike at fish while keeping their bodies perfectly still. Picture armored reptiles that looked like living tanks, cruising through shallow seas in search of mollusks to crush with their powerful jaws. These weren't dinosaurs, but they were every bit as spectacular and strange. On land, the recovery was equally dramatic. The first mammals appeared during the Triassic. Though they were tiny creatures no larger than shrews, they lived alongside massive amphibians with skulls the size of crocodiles, strange sail-backed reptiles that looked like living ships, and armored herbivores that resembled walking fortresses. This was a world where evolution was experimenting with body plans and lifestyles that had never been tried before. The plant life of the Triassic was also undergoing revolutionary changes. The devastating extinction had wiped out most of the ancient plant group that had dominated earlier periods. In their place, new types of vegetation began to flourish. Coniferous forests spread across vast areas of Pangaea, while ferns and cycads created lush undergrowth in more humid regions. These plants would become the foundation for entirely new food webs, supporting herbivores that had never existed before. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the Triassic recovery was how quickly it happened. Within just a few million years of the Great Dying, complex ecosystems were already beginning to form. Predators were hunting prey, herbivores were grazing on new types of plants, and scavengers were cleaning up the remains. The speed of this recovery suggests that life has an almost incredible resilience, an ability to bounce back from even the most catastrophic setbacks. The early Triassic saw the rise of archosaurs, a group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and pterosaurs. These reptiles possessed several key innovations that would make them incredibly successful. They had improved jaw muscles for more powerful bites, longer legs for faster running, and more efficient hearts and lungs for sustained activity. These advantages allowed them to outcompete many of the surviving groups from the Permian period. One of the most fascinating aspects of Triassic life was the incredible diversity of body sizes and shapes. Some creatures were absolutely massive, dwarfing anything we see in modern ecosystems. Others were tiny, filling ecological niches that required extreme miniaturization. This size diversity was made possible by the relatively empty world left behind by the extinction. With so many niches available, evolution could experiment with forms that might not have been viable in more crowded ecosystems. The marine environments of the Triassic were particularly innovative. The extinction had wiped out most of the complex reef systems that had existed during the Permian. In their place, entirely new types of marine communities began to develop. Modern-style corals appeared for the first time, beginning the construction of reef systems that would eventually rival those we see today. Sea urchins, which had nearly gone extinct, began to diversify into new forms. Bivalves, took over many of the ecological roles previously filled by other groups. But it wasn't just the creatures themselves that were changing. The very structure of ecosystems was being reinvented. Food webs became more complex as new types of predators and prey evolved. Symbiotic relationships developed between different species. Migration patterns emerged as animals learned to exploit seasonal changes in food availability. The Triassic was witnessing the birth of ecological complexity as we know it today. The transformation of terrestrial ecosystems was equally remarkable. The early Triassic landscapes were dominated by simple plant communities, often consisting of just a few species spread across vast areas. But as the period progressed, these simple communities gave way to complex forests with multiple canopy levels, diverse understory vegetation, and intricate relationships between plants and animals. The herbivores of the Triassic developed increasingly sophisticated ways of processing plant material. Some evolved powerful jaws for crushing tough vegetation. Others developed complex teeth for grinding leaves and stems. Still others evolved long necks for reaching high into trees. This diversification of feeding strategies allowed multiple herbivore species to coexist in the same environment without directly competing for the same resources. Meanwhile, the predators were becoming increasingly specialized as well. Some evolved for speed, becoming fast pursuit hunters that could chase down prey across open terrain. Others became ambush predators, lying in wait for unsuspecting victims. Still others became scavengers, cleaning up the remains of animals killed by other predators. This diversity of hunting strategies created complex predator-prey relationships that would become hallmarks of modern ecosystems. The Triassic period also saw the emergence of the first flying vertebrates. Pterosaurs took to the skies, developing wings unlike anything seen before or since. These weren't just gliders, but powered flyers capable of active flight. Their success in aerial environments opened up entirely new ecological niches and would eventually lead to some of the largest flying animals ever to exist. As we delve deeper into this incredible period of Earth's history, we'll discover creatures so bizarre and wonderful that they seem almost mythical. We'll explore how the first dinosaurs rose from humble beginnings to become the rulers of their world. We'll witness the birth of ecosystems that would persist for millions of years. And we'll see how life's incredible ability to adapt and innovate turned a post-apocalyptic wasteland into a vibrant, thriving planet once again. The story of the Triassic is ultimately a story of hope and resilience. It shows us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable catastrophe, life finds a way not just to survive, but to flourish in ways more spectacular than ever before. This was the beginning of the modern world, the dawn of the age of dinosaurs, and one of the most remarkable chapters in the 4 billion year story of life on Earth. The transformation that unfolded during the Triassic wasn't just about individual species adapting and evolving. It was about the complete restructuring of how life itself operated on our planet. The survivors of the Great Dying weren't content to simply rebuild what had been lost. Instead, they pioneered entirely new ways of living that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The very first creatures to colonize the devastated post-extinction world weren't complex animals at all. They were stromatolites, ancient bacterial mats that hadn't been dominant since the earliest days of Earth's history. It was as if our planet had rewound the clock by billions of years, returning to its most primitive state before slowly building complexity back up from scratch. These bacterial communities laid the groundwork for everything that would follow, creating the basic chemical conditions necessary for more complex life to eventually return. But here's where the story gets absolutely fascinating. As these simple communities established themselves, they created opportunities for entirely new types of organisms to evolve and thrive. The empty ocean floors that had once teemed with diverse communities of filter feeders were now available for colonization. And the creatures that moved into these vacant territories were unlike anything that had existed before. Take the bivalves, for instance. Before the extinction, these shell-bearing creatures had played relatively minor roles in marine ecosystems. But in the aftermath of the Great Dying, they exploded into prominence, taking over the ecological roles previously filled by entirely different groups of animals. They developed new feeding strategies, new shell designs, and new ways of burrowing into sediments. What had once been a minor supporting cast became the leading players in a completely rewritten ecological drama. The transformation of marine environments during the Triassic reveals something profound about how evolution works. When existing ecological structures collapse, life doesn't simply rebuild identical replacements. Instead, it experiments with radical new approaches that might never have been possible in more stable times. The devastation created a laboratory for evolutionary innovation on a scale that our planet had never experienced before. Consider the ammonoids, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that would become some of the most successful marine predators of the Triassic. The extinction had wiped out most of the existing ammonoid groups, leaving only a few survivors with relatively simple shell designs. But from these humble beginnings, an explosion of new forms emerged. Some developed intricate suture patterns that created incredibly strong shells. Others evolved streamlined shapes for high-speed hunting in open waters. Still others became specialized for life in specific habitats, from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean basins. The diversity of shell forms that appeared during the Triassic ammonoid radiation is absolutely staggering. Some were tightly coiled like nautilus shells, others were loosely wound spirals, and still others were nearly straight. Each design represented a different solution to the challenges of marine predation, and their success demonstrates just how creative evolution can be when given the opportunity to experiment. But the innovations weren't limited to shell design. These creatures developed new hunting strategies, new reproductive behaviors, and new ways of navigating their underwater world. Some species appear to have been capable of jet propulsion, shooting through the water to catch prey or escape predators. Others seem to have been ambush hunters, lurking motionless until unsuspecting victims came within striking distance. The success of these marine innovations had profound effects on the entire structure of ocean ecosystems. New predator-prey relationships emerged as ammonoids began hunting different types of prey. Scavenging behaviors developed as creatures learned to exploit the remains of successful hunts. Competition for resources drove further evolutionary innovation as species attempted to outcompete their rivals for limited food sources. Meanwhile, on the seafloor itself, an entirely different revolution was taking place. The extinction had cleared away most of the complex communities that had dominated Permian ocean bottoms. In their place, new types of bottom-dwelling organisms began to establish themselves. These weren't just simple replacements for what had been lost. They were fundamentally different approaches to seafloor living. Crinoids, those flower-like echinoderms that had been decimated by the extinction, slowly began to reappear in Triassic seas. But the species that emerged were different from their Permian ancestors. They had evolved new feeding strategies, new attachment mechanisms, and new ways of reproducing. Some developed more flexible stems that allowed them to bend with ocean currents rather than breaking. Others evolved specialized feeding structures that could capture different types of food particles. The gradual recovery of seafloor communities created cascading effects throughout the entire marine ecosystem. As filter feeders became more abundant, water clarity improved. As burrowing organisms returned, seafloor sediments became more oxygenated. These changes created new opportunities for other species, leading to a positive feedback loop that accelerated the pace of recovery. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the marine recovery was how interconnected it became. Unlike the relatively simple communities that had existed immediately after the extinction, the Triassic seas developed complex webs of interdependence. Predators relied on specific prey species. Prey animals developed defensive strategies against particular threats. Scavengers learned to follow certain predators to exploit their kills. These intricate relationships created stable ecosystems that could persist for millions of years. The story becomes even more incredible when we look at the development of coral reefs during the Triassic. The massive reef systems that had dominated Permian seas had been completely destroyed by the extinction. For millions of years, the shallow tropical waters that had once supported thriving reef communities remained barren and lifeless. But gradually, new types of coral began to appear. These weren't the same species that had built the Permian reefs. They were entirely new organisms that had evolved independently from soft-bodied sea anemones. Their success represents one of the most remarkable examples of convergent evolution in Earth's history. Faced with similar environmental challenges, these creatures independently developed the same basic solution, building calcium carbonate skeletons that could create large, complex structures capable of supporting diverse communities of other organisms. The new coral reefs that emerged during the Triassic were different from their predecessors in fundamental ways. They used different construction techniques, supported different types of associated organisms, and created different types of habitat complexity. Yet they served the same basic ecological function, demonstrating how evolution can find multiple solutions to the same environmental challenges. The success of these new reef systems had profound implications for marine biodiversity. Coral reefs create some of the most complex and productive ecosystems on Earth, supporting vast numbers of species in relatively small areas. As Triassic reefs became established, they became centers of evolutionary innovation, generating new species at remarkable rates. Fish communities around these reefs developed new feeding strategies to exploit the abundant resources available. Some became specialized coral feeders, developing unique jaw structures for scraping algae and small organisms from coral surfaces. Others became cleaners, removing parasites from larger fish. Still others became predators, hunting among the complex three-dimensional structures created by the coral growth. The development of complex reef ecosystems during the Triassic marked a crucial turning point in marine evolution. These environments became laboratories for biological innovation, generating new species and new ecological relationships at unprecedented rates. The diversity and complexity that emerged from these systems would provide the foundation for marine ecosystems that persist to this day. As we examine these marine transformations, we begin to see a pattern that would characterize the entire Triassic recovery. Life wasn't simply rebuilding what had been lost. It was pioneering entirely new approaches to existence that would prove more successful and more resilient than what had come before. The devastation of the Great Dying had cleared the way for innovations that might never have been possible in more stable times. But the innovations weren't limited to the oceans. On land, an equally dramatic transformation was taking place as terrestrial ecosystems began to recover from the catastrophic losses they had suffered. The empty landscapes left behind by the extinction provided unprecedented opportunities for evolutionary experimentation, and the results would reshape the nature of life on land forever. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable evolutionary radiations in Earth's history, as the ancestors of dinosaurs began their rise to dominance in terrestrial ecosystems around the world. The terrestrial recovery that began in the aftermath of the Great Dying was nothing short of extraordinary. Picture vast stretches of barren rock and ash-covered soil where once thriving forests had stood. The land was essentially a blank slate, waiting for life to write an entirely new chapter in Earth's history. And what emerged from this desolation would fundamentally change the rules of existence on our planet. The first creatures to venture back onto the devastated landscapes were small, hardy survivors that had managed to endure the catastrophe by hiding in underground burrows or remote refuges. These weren't the dominant animals of the Permian world. They were the underdogs, the species that had lived in the shadows while larger, more specialized creatures ruled the earth. But now, with their competition eliminated, these humble survivors had their moment to shine. Among the most successful of these early colonizers were the therapsids, a group of mammal-like reptiles that would play a crucial role in the Triassic recovery. These creatures possessed several key advantages that made them perfectly suited for the harsh post-extinction world. They had efficient metabolisms that allowed them to survive on limited food resources. They had relatively advanced parental care behaviors that helped their offspring survive in challenging conditions. And perhaps most importantly, they had the behavioral flexibility to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. As these therapsids began to diversify and spread across the recovering landscapes, they faced competition from an entirely unexpected source. A new group of reptiles was emerging from the same post-extinction recovery, and these creatures would eventually challenge the therapsids for dominance of terrestrial ecosystems. These were the archosaurs, and they represented a completely different approach to terrestrial life. Where therapsids relied on metabolic efficiency and behavioral flexibility, archosaurs developed powerful musculature and aggressive hunting strategies. They had longer legs that allowed them to run faster than most of their competitors. They had stronger jaws that could deliver devastating bites, and they had a level of activity and endurance that allowed them to hunt persistently across vast territories. The competition between these two groups would define much of the Triassic period. It was essentially a contest between two different evolutionary strategies, played out across millions of years and thousands of species. The therapsids represented the old approach: careful resource management, behavioral adaptation, and survival through efficiency. The archosaurs represented something entirely new: explosive power, aggressive expansion, and dominance through force. Initially, the therapsids seemed to have the advantage. They were already established in many ecosystems. They had proven survival strategies, and they were well adapted to the harsh conditions of the early Triassic. Some species grew to enormous sizes, becoming the apex predators of their time. Imagine creatures the size of large crocodiles, but with the advanced physiology and behavior of early mammals. These were formidable animals that seemed destined to inherit the earth. But the archosaurs were not content to remain in secondary roles. They began developing innovations that would give them crucial advantages in the competition for terrestrial dominance. Some evolved bipedal locomotion, allowing them to run faster and more efficiently than their four-legged competitors. Others developed more sophisticated hunting techniques, learning to cooperate in groups or to use stealth and ambush tactics. Perhaps most importantly, the archosaurs began experimenting with body sizes and shapes that had never been tried before. Some became massive predators that could take down the largest herbivores. Others became small, agile hunters that could exploit resources unavailable to larger competitors. This size diversification allowed archosaurs to occupy multiple ecological niches simultaneously, giving them a significant advantage in ecosystem competition. The herbivorous side of this evolutionary arms race was equally dramatic. The plant-eating animals of the Triassic faced enormous challenges as they attempted to exploit the recovering vegetation. The plants themselves were different from what had existed before the extinction. Many familiar groups had disappeared entirely, replaced by new types of conifers, ferns, and seed plants that required different digestive strategies. Some herbivores responded to these challenges by becoming larger and more powerful, developing the size and strength necessary to process tough, fibrous plant material. Others became more specialized, evolving complex teeth and jaw muscles for grinding specific types of vegetation. Still others developed longer necks or other anatomical modifications that allowed them to reach food sources unavailable to their competitors. The result was an explosion of herbivore diversity that created the foundation for complex terrestrial food webs. Different species specialized on different plant types, different feeding strategies, and different habitats. This diversification reduced competition between species while maximizing the utilization of available plant resources. But the most remarkable innovation of Triassic herbivores wasn't anatomical at all. It was behavioral. Many species began developing sophisticated social structures that allowed them to share information about food sources, coordinate defensive strategies against predators, and care for their young more effectively. These social behaviors gave herbivores crucial advantages in the dangerous world of the Triassics. Meanwhile, the predators were developing their own behavioral innovations. Some began hunting in coordinated groups, allowing them to take down prey much larger than any individual could handle alone. Others developed specialized stalking techniques, learning to use terrain and vegetation to approach prey undetected. Still others became scavengers, developing the social structures and behavioral flexibility necessary to exploit the kills of other predators. The interaction between these evolving predator and prey communities created a dynamic feedback system that drove rapid evolutionary change. As prey animals developed better defenses, predators were forced to evolve more effective hunting strategies. As predators became more dangerous, prey species developed new escape behaviors and defensive adaptations. This evolutionary arms race accelerated the pace of innovation throughout Triassic ecosystems. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of the first truly massive terrestrial predators since the extinction. These weren't just large animals. They were ecological dominators that could influence entire ecosystem structures through their predatory pressure. Their presence forced other species to modify their behaviors, their habitat use, and even their evolutionary trajectories. The success of these apex predators had cascading effects throughout terrestrial communities. Herbivore populations became more mobile, developing migration patterns that allowed them to avoid areas of high predation risk. Smaller predators were forced to specialize on prey that the giants couldn't or wouldn't hunt. Scavengers developed more sophisticated social structures to compete for access to the massive carcasses left behind by successful hunts. But perhaps the most important consequence of this predator evolution was the pressure it placed on potential prey species to develop new defensive strategies. Some herbivores responded by becoming larger and more heavily armored. Others developed greater speed and agility. Still others evolved complex social behaviors that allowed groups to detect and respond to predator threats more effectively. These defensive innovations weren't limited to potential prey animals. Even smaller predators had to develop strategies for avoiding the attention of their larger, more dangerous relatives. Some became nocturnal, hunting when the giants were less active. Others specialized on prey that was too small or too difficult for larger predators to bother with. Still others developed camouflage and stealth behaviors that allowed them to avoid detection entirely. The result of all these evolutionary pressures was the development of terrestrial ecosystems more complex and dynamic than anything that had existed before the Great Dying. The simple communities of the early Triassic gave way to intricate webs of interdependence involving dozens of species in complex predator-prey, competitive, and cooperative relationships. These ecosystem developments set the stage for one of the most significant events in the history of life on Earth. Deep within the Archosaur lineage, a new group was beginning to evolve that would eventually surpass all of their relatives in success and diversity. These early representatives were small bipedal creatures with lightweight bones and active lifestyles. They possessed several key innovations that would prove crucial to their eventual success. Improved respiratory systems that allowed for sustained high activity levels. More efficient locomotion that reduced energy costs. And behavioral flexibility that allowed them to adapt quickly to changing conditions. At first, these creatures were just another minor component of Triassic ecosystems. They lived alongside dozens of other Archosaur species, competed with established therapsids, and struggled to find their place in the complex web of terrestrial life. But they possessed something special, a combination of traits that would eventually allow them to not just survive, but to revolutionize life on Earth. These were the first dinosaurs, and their rise to prominence would transform our planet in ways that are still visible today. But their story was just beginning, emerging from the incredible diversity and innovation that characterized the Triassic recovery. The stage was set for the next chapter in Earth's history, one that would see these humble beginnings evolve into some of the most spectacular creatures our planet has ever known. The early dinosaurs represented more than just another successful group of reptiles. They embodied the innovative spirit that had defined the entire Triassic recovery, the willingness to experiment with new approaches to existence that had turned a post-apocalyptic wasteland into a thriving, diverse world. Their success would be built on the foundation of resilience and creativity that had characterized life's response to the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history. As we prepare to explore their remarkable journey from obscure survivors to planetary dominators, we see in their story the same themes that had defined the entire Triassic period: the power of innovation over tradition, the triumph of adaptability over specialization, and the incredible capacity of life to not just survive catastrophe, but to use it as an opportunity for revolutionary change. The emergence of these first dinosaurs wasn't the dramatic takeover that we might imagine from Hollywood movies. Instead, it was a gradual infiltration into ecosystems already crowded with other successful groups. These early dinosaurs were actually quite small, most no larger than a modern turkey, and they faced intense competition from creatures that had already established themselves as the rulers of the Triassic world. What made these early dinosaurs special wasn't their size or their immediate dominance. It was their incredible efficiency. While other archosaurs relied on brute force and massive size to secure their place in the ecosystem, dinosaurs developed something far more subtle, but ultimately more powerful. They perfected the art of being metabolically economical while maintaining high activity levels. This might sound boring compared to the massive jaws and armored hides of their competitors, but it was revolutionary. Think about it this way. In the harsh world of the Triassic, resources were often scarce and unpredictable. A massive predator might dominate when food was abundant, but what happened during lean times? These giants required enormous amounts of energy just to maintain their basic bodily functions. A smaller, more efficient dinosaur could survive on a fraction of the resources while remaining just as active and alert as its larger competitors. But efficiency alone wasn't enough to guarantee success. The early dinosaurs also possessed another crucial advantage that would prove decisive in the long term. They were behaviorally flexible in ways that their competitors simply weren't. While other archosaurs became increasingly specialized for specific hunting strategies or particular types of prey, dinosaurs maintained the ability to adapt their behavior to changing circumstances. This flexibility manifested in numerous ways. Some early dinosaur species could switch between different types of prey depending on availability. Others could modify their hunting strategies based on the terrain or the behavior of their targets. Still others could adjust their social behaviors, sometimes hunting alone and sometimes cooperating in groups depending on the situation. This behavioral plasticity gave them a tremendous advantage in the unpredictable world of the Triassic. The anatomical innovations that supported these behavioral advantages were equally impressive. Early dinosaurs developed hollow bones that reduced their weight without sacrificing strength. This allowed them to move more quickly and efficiently than their solid-boned competitors while using less energy. They evolved more sophisticated respiratory systems that could extract oxygen more efficiently from the air, supporting their active lifestyles without the metabolic costs that burdened other reptiles. Perhaps most importantly, they developed improved nervous systems that allowed for more complex behaviors and faster responses to environmental changes. While other archosaurs relied primarily on instinctual behaviors, dinosaurs began developing the capacity for learning and behavioral modification that would eventually make them incredibly successful in diverse environments. These advantages weren't immediately obvious to other creatures in Triassic ecosystems. The early dinosaurs remained relatively rare and seemed to occupy marginal ecological niches. They were the scrappy underdogs of the archosaur world, living in the shadows of more imposing relatives. But they were quietly accumulating the traits that would eventually allow them to inherit the Earth. The key to understanding early dinosaur success lies in recognizing that they weren't trying to compete directly with the established giants of their time. Instead, they were developing an entirely different approach to terrestrial life. Where other predators focused on becoming bigger and stronger, dinosaurs focused on becoming smarter and more adaptable. Where others became increasingly specialized, dinosaurs maintained their versatility. This strategic difference became particularly important as Triassic ecosystems continued to evolve and change. The climate remained unstable, with periodic droughts, floods, and temperature fluctuations that challenged all terrestrial life. Highly specialized creatures that had adapted to specific conditions often struggled when those conditions changed. But the behaviorally flexible dinosaurs could adjust their strategies to cope with new circumstances. The social behaviors of early dinosaurs were particularly sophisticated. Evidence suggests that some species lived in family groups with complex hierarchies and cooperative behaviors. Parents provided extended care for their young, teaching them hunting techniques and social skills that improved their survival chances. Some species may have even developed primitive forms of communication that allowed them to coordinate group activities and share information about food sources and predator threats. These social innovations gave dinosaurs significant advantages over their more solitary competitors. Group living allowed them to take down larger prey than any individual could handle alone. Cooperative parental care improved juvenile survival rates. Information sharing helped groups locate food sources and avoid dangerous areas. These behaviors created positive feedback loops that accelerated dinosaur success and diversification. But the rise of dinosaurs was just one part of a much larger transformation taking place in Triassic ecosystems. The period saw the emergence of numerous other groups that would play crucial roles in shaping the future of life on Earth. Flying reptiles took to the skies for the first time, opening up entirely new ecological niches. The first true mammals appeared, though they remained small and nocturnal. Turtles evolved their distinctive body plan, while crocodile relatives diversified into forms unlike anything we see today. The success of pterosaurs was particularly remarkable. These flying reptiles didn't just glide like some modern animals. They developed powered flight that allowed them to actively soar and maneuver through the air. Their wing structure was completely different from that of birds or bats, representing an independent solution to the challenge of vertebrate flight. The success of pterosaurs demonstrated that the innovative spirit of the Triassic wasn't limited to terrestrial environments. Early pterosaurs were relatively small creatures, probably feeding on insects and small vertebrates. But their mastery of aerial environments gave them access to resources that were completely unavailable to ground-dwelling competitors. They could hunt flying insects that no other vertebrates could catch. They could nest in cliff faces and treetops that were inaccessible to predators. They could travel vast distances in search of food or suitable breeding sites. The development of flight had profound implications for ecosystem structure. Pterosaurs created new predator-prey relationships, hunting creatures that had previously been safe from vertebrate predation. They also became important dispersal agents, potentially carrying seeds and small organisms between distant locations. Their presence added a vertical dimension to ecosystem complexity that hadn't existed before. Meanwhile, the first mammals were carving out their own unique niche in Triassic ecosystems. These tiny creatures, most no larger than modern shrews, survived by being active at night when most other predators were less active. Their small size and nocturnal habits allowed them to exploit food sources that were ignored by larger animals, including insects, small invertebrates, and probably some plant material. The success of early mammals was built on several key innovations. They developed more sophisticated temperature regulation that allowed them to remain active in cooler conditions when reptilian competitors became sluggish. They evolved improved hearing that helped them navigate and hunt in darkness. They developed more complex parental care behaviors that increased offspring survival rates in a dangerous world. But perhaps most importantly, early mammals developed enlarged brains relative to their body size. This neurological investment supported more complex behaviors, better learning abilities, and improved problem-solving skills. While they remained small and seemingly insignificant during the Triassic, these traits would eventually prove crucial to mammalian success in later periods. The emergence of turtles during the Triassic represents one of the most successful evolutionary experiments in Earth's history. The basic turtle body plan that evolved during this period has remained virtually unchanged for over 200 million years, suggesting that these creatures achieved an almost perfect solution to their ecological challenges. Early turtles were different from modern species in several important ways. Some retained teeth rather than the horny beaks of living turtles. Others had shells that weren't completely closed, leaving gaps that modern turtles don't have. But they had already developed the fundamental turtle characteristics: a protective shell, a retractable head and limbs, and a lifestyle that combined terrestrial and aquatic elements. The success of the turtle body plan lay in its incredible versatility. The shell provided protection from predators while allowing enough mobility for active foraging. The ability to retract vulnerable body parts into the shell gave turtles a defensive strategy that was almost impossible for predators to overcome. The combination of terrestrial and aquatic capabilities allowed turtles to exploit resources in multiple environments. But the turtle story also illustrates an important principle about Triassic evolution. Success didn't always require constant innovation and change. Sometimes the best strategy was to develop a highly effective body plan and stick with it. While other groups continued to evolve and diversify, turtles found a formula that worked and maintained it across geological time. The crocodile relatives of the Triassic were far more diverse than their modern descendants, occupying ecological niches that seem almost impossible to imagine today. Some were fully terrestrial predators that ran on the hind legs like dinosaurs. Others were herbivores with peg-like teeth for processing plant material. Still others were armored giants that dominated their ecosystems through sheer size and defensive capability. This diversity of crocodilian relatives demonstrates just how open the Triassic world was to evolutionary experimentation. Groups that would later become highly specialized were free to explore radically different lifestyles and body plans. The ancestors of modern crocodiles were just one branch of a much larger evolutionary tree that included creatures adapted for almost every conceivable terrestrial niche. Some of these crocodile relatives were among the apex predators of their time, reaching sizes that rivaled or exceeded the largest dinosaurs. They had powerful jaws, massive skulls, and the kind of predatory presence that could shape entire ecosystem structures. Their success demonstrates that dinosaurs weren't the only archosaur group capable of achieving ecological dominance during the Triassic. The competition between these various crocodile relatives and early dinosaurs was intense and prolonged. For millions of years, the outcome was far from certain. Different groups achieved temporary dominance in different regions and different time periods. The eventual success of dinosaurs wasn't inevitable, but rather the result of gradual advantages that accumulated over geological time. As the Middle Triassic progressed into the Late Triassic, the competitive landscape began to shift in subtle but important ways. Climate changes, continued ecosystem development, and ongoing evolutionary innovation created new opportunities and challenges for all terrestrial life. The stage was being set for a series of changes that would ultimately determine which groups would dominate the post-Triassic world. The Late Triassic saw the continued diversification of dinosaur lineages into forms that began to hint at their future dominance. Some species grew larger, developing the size and strength necessary to compete directly with established predators. Others became more specialized, evolving adaptations for specific hunting strategies or particular types of prey. Still others maintained their versatility while improving their efficiency and effectiveness. But dinosaur success wasn't just about individual species becoming more competitive. It was also about the group as a whole, developing greater ecological resilience. As dinosaur diversity increased, the group became less vulnerable to environmental changes or competitive pressure from other species. If one dinosaur species declined due to changing conditions, others could expand to fill the vacant niche. This ecological resilience would prove crucial as the Triassic period approached its end. Unknown to the diverse communities of animals that had worked so hard to rebuild terrestrial ecosystems, another major extinction event was approaching. The Late Triassic extinction wouldn't be as severe as the great dying that had ended the Permian, but it would still eliminate many successful groups and reshape the competitive landscape once again. The causes of the Late Triassic extinction remain somewhat mysterious, but its effects were profound and lasting. Many of the archosaur groups that had dominated Triassic ecosystems disappeared entirely. Several lineages of therapsids went extinct. Even some early dinosaur groups failed to survive the transition to the Jurassic period. But here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. The groups that did survive the Late Triassic extinction weren't necessarily the ones that had been most successful during the Triassic itself. Instead, survival seemed to favor creatures with particular combinations of traits that provided resilience in the face of environmental upheaval. Dinosaurs possessed many of these crucial survival traits. Their behavioral flexibility allowed them to adapt to changing conditions. Their metabolic efficiency helped them survive when resources became scarce. Their social behaviors provided mutual support during difficult times. Their diverse body sizes and ecological strategies meant that at least some dinosaur species could persist, even if others went extinct. The Late Triassic extinction essentially cleared away many of dinosaurs' most successful competitors, creating opportunities that the survivors were perfectly positioned to exploit. It was as if evolution had been conducting a long-term experiment in competitive strategies, and the extinction event revealed which approaches were most fundamentally sound. The world that emerged from the Late Triassic extinction was dramatically different from the one that had characterized most of the period. Dinosaurs, which had been minor players for most of the Triassic, suddenly found themselves among the dominant terrestrial vertebrates. The diverse communities of archosaurs that had defined Triassic ecosystems were largely gone, replaced by simpler communities dominated by dinosaurs and a few other surviving groups. This transition marked the true beginning of the age of dinosaurs. The Triassic had been a period of recovery and experimentation, a time when multiple groups competed for dominance in the post-extinction world. The late Triassic extinction settled that competition decisively in favor of dinosaurs, setting the stage for their spectacular radiation during the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. But the success of dinosaurs shouldn't overshadow the broader significance of the Triassic recovery. This period demonstrated life's incredible capacity for innovation and adaptation in the face of catastrophic change. It showed how extinction events, while devastating in the short term, can create opportunities for evolutionary experimentation that would be impossible under more stable conditions. The Triassic period transformed a dead world into a living laboratory where evolution could test new approaches to existence. The innovations that emerged during this time didn't just allow life to recover from the Great Dying. They created the foundation for biological diversity that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. As we look back on this remarkable period in Earth's history, we see a story that's ultimately about resilience, innovation, and the incredible creativity of life itself. The Triassic wasn't just the dawn of the dinosaurs. It was the birth of the modern biological world, a time when life proved that even the most catastrophic setbacks can become opportunities for revolutionary change. The transformation wasn't just happening on land. As terrestrial ecosystems were undergoing their dramatic restructuring, the oceans were experiencing their own remarkable renaissance. The marine environments of the Triassic were becoming testing grounds for some of the most extraordinary evolutionary experiments our planet had ever witnessed. And the creatures that emerged from these aquatic laboratories were so bizarre and spectacular that they seem almost mythical today. Picture this. You're diving in the warm, shallow seas that covered much of Europe during the Middle Triassic. The water is crystal clear and surprisingly warm even by tropical standards. As you descend through the water column, you encounter creatures that defy every expectation you might have about ancient marine life. These aren't the simple, primitive organisms you might imagine from such an ancient time. These are sophisticated predators and bizarre specialists that had evolved solutions to aquatic life that had never been tried before. Swimming through these ancient waters, you might first encounter something that looks almost like a seal, but with a reptilian twist that makes it utterly alien. This is a nothosaur, and it represents one of the most successful early attempts at returning to marine life after the Great Dying. These creatures had evolved from terrestrial ancestors, but they had undergone such radical modifications for aquatic life that they bore little resemblance to their land-dwelling relatives. The nothosaurs had developed paddle-like limbs that were perfectly adapted for underwater propulsion. Their bodies were streamlined for efficient swimming, yet they retained enough terrestrial capability to haul out onto beaches and rocky shores. They were living bridges between the terrestrial and marine worlds. equally at home hunting fish in the open ocean or pursuing prey along coastal margins. But here's what makes Gnathosaurs truly remarkable. They weren't just successful in one particular niche. They diversified into an incredible array of forms, each adapted for different aspects of marine life. Some were small and agile, perfect for hunting in shallow coral reefs and rocky crevices. Others grew to impressive sizes, becoming open ocean predators that could take down prey as large as themselves. The feeding strategies of Gnathosaurs were as diverse as their body forms. Some developed long, narrow skulls filled with sharp teeth, perfect for catching slippery fish. Others evolved broader heads with crushing teeth, allowing them to feed on hard-shelled mollusks and crustaceans. Still others became generalist predators, capable of switching between different prey types depending on availability. But the Gnathosaurs were just one part of a much larger marine revolution. Living alongside them were creatures so strange that paleontologists initially struggled to understand how they could have functioned as living animals. These were the placoodonts, and they represent one of the most unusual solutions to marine herbivory ever evolved. Imagine an animal that looks like someone crossed a sea turtle with a walrus and then added armor plating from a medieval knight. That's essentially what placoodonts were. These bizarre reptiles had evolved a completely unique approach to life in shallow marine environments. They possessed powerful limbs that functioned as both swimming paddles and walking legs, allowing them to move efficiently both in water and on land. The most distinctive feature of placoodonts was their incredible dental apparatus. They had protruding front teeth that functioned like chisels, perfect for prying shellfish off rocks and coral surfaces. But the real innovation was in the roof of their mouths, where they had evolved massive crushing teeth that could pulverize even the hardest shells. It was like having a built-in nutcracker capable of dealing with the toughest marine invertebrates. The success of this feeding strategy is evident from the abundance of placoodont fossils found in Triassic marine deposits. These creatures became the dominant large herbivores in many shallow marine ecosystems, filling ecological roles that had been vacant since the extinction. They created new predator-prey relationships and contributed to the development of complex marine food webs. But perhaps the most extraordinary marine reptiles of the Triassic were just beginning their evolutionary journey toward forms that would become even more spectacular. The ichthyosaurs represent one of the most remarkable examples of convergent evolution in the fossil record. These reptiles had independently evolved body forms that were virtually identical to modern dolphins, despite being separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history. The early ichthyosaurs of the Triassic were already showing the fundamental adaptations that would make their descendants some of the most successful marine predators of all time. They had developed streamlined bodies with powerful tails for high-speed swimming. Their limbs had been completely transformed into steering flippers. Their skulls had elongated into long, narrow rostrums, filled with sharp teeth, perfect for catching fish. But what made ichthyosaurs truly special wasn't just their physical adaptations. It was their approach to marine predation. These creatures had evolved to be pursuit predators, using speed and endurance to run down their prey in the open ocean. They were the cheetahs of the ancient seas, capable of burst speeds that allowed them to catch even the fastest fish. The success of this predatory strategy is evident from the rapid diversification of ichthyosaurs during the Triassic. Different species evolved different body sizes and feeding specializations, allowing multiple species to coexist in the same marine environments without directly competing for resources. Some remained small and agile, perfect for hunting in coastal waters. Others grew larger, becoming open ocean predators capable of taking down substantial prey. The evolution of these sophisticated marine predators had profound effects on marine ecosystem structure. Fish populations had to develop new escape strategies and defensive behaviors. Smaller marine reptiles were forced to specialize in prey that the ichthyosaurs couldn't or wouldn't pursue. The entire dynamics of marine predation were being rewritten by these innovative hunters. Meanwhile, in the deeper parts of Triassic oceans, another group of marine reptiles was developing an approach to aquatic life that was so unusual it seems almost impossible. These creatures evolved necks that were longer than their bodies and tails combined, creating animals that looked more like living question marks than functional predators. The feeding strategy employed by these long-necked marine reptiles was unlike anything seen before or since. They could position their bodies in one location while extending their necks over vast distances to strike at prey. This allowed them to hunt while expending minimal energy on locomotion. They could lurk motionless in murky water, then suddenly extend their necks to snatch unsuspecting fish that passed within striking distance. The biomechanics of supporting such an extreme neck structure required numerous innovations. These creatures developed specialized vertebrae that could flex and extend without losing structural integrity. They evolved powerful neck muscles that could accelerate their heads with lightning speed. They developed sensory systems that could accurately target prey, even in poor visibility conditions. The success of this bizarre hunting strategy demonstrates just how creative evolution can be when exploring new ecological niches. These creatures weren't trying to compete directly with other marine predators. Instead, they were pioneering an entirely different approach to aquatic hunting that allowed them to exploit resources that were unavailable to more conventional predators. But the marine innovations of the Triassic weren't limited to large, spectacular predators. Some of the most significant evolutionary developments were happening among smaller, less obvious creatures that were quietly revolutionizing marine ecosystems from the bottom up. The recovery of marine invertebrate communities was creating the foundation for all of the larger-scale changes taking place in Triassic oceans. Consider the ammonoids, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that were undergoing their own remarkable radiation during the Triassic recovery. These creatures weren't just rebuilding populations that had been devastated by the extinction. They were pioneering new approaches to shell design, locomotion, and predation that would make them incredibly successful for the next 150 million years. The shell innovations developed by Triassic ammonoids were particularly remarkable. Different species evolved different coiling patterns, suture designs, and shell ornamentations that gave them advantages in different marine environments. Some developed tightly coiled shells that provided maximum strength with minimum weight. Others evolved loosely coiled shells that reduced drag during swimming. Still others developed specialized shell sculptures that may have provided camouflage or hydrodynamic advantages. Oh, these shell innovations weren't just aesthetic differences. They represented fundamentally different solutions to the challenges of marine predation. The complex suture patterns that characterized many Triassic ammonoids created shells that were incredibly strong, yet surprisingly lightweight. The various coiling strategies allowed different species to optimize their shells for different swimming styles and habitat preferences. The success of these innovations is evident from the explosive diversification of ammonoids during the Triassic. Different lineages explored radically different approaches to shell design and marine lifestyle. Some became fast-swimming pursuit predators. Others evolved as ambush hunters. Still others developed specialized feeding strategies that allowed them to exploit particular types of prey. This ammonoid radiation had cascading effects throughout marine ecosystems. Different species created different predation pressures on marine invertebrates. Their success supported populations of larger predators that fed on ammonoids themselves. Their shells, after death, created habitat structures that were colonized by other marine organisms. The recovery of coral reef ecosystems during the Triassic represents another crucial component of marine ecosystem restoration. The massive reef systems that had been completely destroyed by the Great Dying were slowly being rebuilt by entirely new groups of coral organisms. These weren't the same species that had built Permian reefs, but rather completely new lineages that had independently evolved the ability to construct large carbonate structures. The new coral species that appeared during the Triassic had several advantages over their predecessors. They seemed to be more resistant to the environmental fluctuations that had contributed to the end Permian extinction. They developed more efficient symbiotic relationships with algae that enhanced their growth rates. They evolved more sophisticated reproductive strategies that allowed them to colonize new areas more rapidly. The establishment of these new reef systems created opportunities for the evolution of entirely new types of marine communities. Fish species developed specialized feeding strategies for exploiting coral-associated resources. Invertebrates evolved new ways of living within the three-dimensional structures created by coral growth. Predators learned to use reef complexity to their advantage in hunting strategies. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Triassic marine recovery was how interconnected all of these developments became. The success of reef-building corals created habitat for fish populations that supported ichthyosaur and nothosaur predators. The diversification of ammonoids created food webs that sustained larger marine reptiles. The evolution of specialized feeding strategies by placodonts affected the distribution and evolution of marine invertebrates. This interconnectedness created positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of marine recovery. As one group became more successful, it created opportunities for other groups to to diversify and specialize. The result was the rapid development of marine ecosystems that were more complex and more productive than anything that had existed before the Great Dying. The innovations weren't limited to large charismatic species. Throughout Triassic marine environments, smaller organisms were undergoing their own evolutionary radiations. Sea urchins, which had nearly gone extinct at the end of the Permian, began diversifying into new forms adapted for different marine habitats. Bivalves expanded into ecological roles that had previously been filled by entirely different groups. Bryozoans, crinoids, and other filter feeders developed new strategies for exploiting marine productivity. Even the basic structure of marine food webs was being transformed. The simple, relatively linear food chains that had characterized the immediate post-extinction period gave way to complex webs of interdependence involving dozens of species in intricate predator-prey, competitive, and mutualistic relationships. These complex food webs were more stable and more resilient than the simple communities that had existed immediately after the extinction. The geographic scope of these marine innovations was truly global. Similar evolutionary experiments were taking place in oceans around the world, though with regional variations that reflected different environmental conditions and evolutionary histories. The breakup of Pangaea that began during the late Triassic created new oceanic basins and changed circulation patterns, providing additional opportunities for evolutionary diversification. As marine ecosystems became more complex and more productive, they began to influence terrestrial environments in important ways. Seabirds, though not yet evolved, were replaced by flying reptiles that could exploit marine resources while nesting on land. Coastal environments became more productive as marine nutrients were transported inland by various processes. The success of marine ecosystems provided stable food sources that supported the evolution of semi-aquatic terrestrial animals. The late Triassic extinction event that would eventually reshape terrestrial ecosystems also affected marine communities, though generally less severely than their land-dwelling counterparts. Many marine reptile groups survived the transition to the Jurassic, where they would continue to diversify and evolve into even more spectacular forms. The ammonoids persisted and continued their remarkable evolutionary radiation. Coral reefs, having survived one mass extinction, proved resilient enough to persist through another. But the most important legacy of Triassic marine innovation wasn't any particular group of organisms. It was the establishment of marine ecosystem structures and processes that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. The basic patterns of marine predation, the fundamental approaches to reef construction, and the essential strategies for marine life had all been established or re-established during the Triassic recovery. Looking at the totality of marine recovery during the Triassic, we see a story that parallels the terrestrial recovery, but with its own unique characteristics. Like their land-dwelling counterparts, marine organisms didn't simply rebuild what had been lost. They pioneered new approaches to aquatic life that were often more sophisticated and more successful than what had existed before the Great Dying. The marine innovations of the Triassic demonstrate that evolution's response to catastrophe isn't just about survival and recovery. It's about exploration and innovation on a scale that would be impossible under more stable conditions. The empty oceans left behind by the end Permian extinction became laboratories for biological experimentation that generated solutions to aquatic life that had never been tried before. As we consider the broader significance of these marine developments, we begin to see how they fit into the larger story of Triassic recovery and innovation. Both on land and in the sea, life was responding to catastrophe, not just by surviving, but by fundamentally reimagining what it meant to be alive on planet Earth. The organisms that emerged from this process weren't just different from their predecessors. They were representatives of entirely new approaches to existence that would define biological diversity for geological ages to come. The success of these marine innovations, combined with the terrestrial developments we've already explored, created a world that was more biologically diverse, more ecologically complex, and more evolutionarily dynamic than anything that had existed before. The Triassic period had transformed a dead planet into a biological powerhouse that was ready to support some of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. But even as these remarkable marine and terrestrial communities were establishing themselves, larger forces were at work that would once again reshape the biological landscape. The late Triassic extinction was approaching, and with it would come another round of evolutionary opportunity and innovation. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in Earth's biological history, one that would see the organisms that had survived and thrived during the Triassic recovery face yet another test of their evolutionary resilience. The late Triassic world was reaching a crescendo of biological diversity and innovation that would have been unimaginable just 50 million years earlier. Yet this spectacular renaissance was about to face another major test, one that would determine which of the Triassic's remarkable evolutionary experiments would survive to shape the future of life on Earth. The transformation that was sweeping across the late Triassic world wasn't just about individual species becoming more successful. It was about the fundamental restructuring of how ecosystems operated on a planetary scale. The communities that had emerged from the ashes of the Great Dying weren't simply rebuilt versions of what had existed before. They represented entirely new approaches to biological organization that were more resilient, more complex, and more dynamic than anything our planet had previously supported. But as these remarkable communities reached their peak of diversity and sophistication, subtle changes were beginning to ripple through the global environment. The massive supercontinent of Pangaea, which had remained relatively stable throughout most of the Triassic, was starting to show the first signs of the geological forces that would eventually tear it apart. Deep beneath the surface, volcanic activity was increasing in intensity and frequency. Climate patterns were shifting in ways that would challenge even the most adaptable organisms. These weren't sudden, catastrophic changes like the Great Dying that had ended the Permian. Instead, they were gradual shifts that accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. creating pressures that would test the resilience of every ecosystem on Earth. The organisms that had worked so hard to rebuild the biological world were about to face another examination of their evolutionary fitness. The first signs of trouble appeared in the marine realm, where the delicate balance of ocean chemistry began to shift in ominous ways. The massive volcanic systems that were beginning to fracture Pangaea were releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This greenhouse gas was slowly warming the planet's climate, but it was also making the oceans more acidic as it dissolved into seawater. For the marine communities that had spent millions of years rebuilding complex reef systems and intricate food webs, this chemical change represented a serious threat. The corals that had worked so hard to construct new reef ecosystems found their ability to build calcium carbonate skeletons increasingly compromised. The ammonoids, with their elaborate spiral shells, discovered that maintaining their protective armor was becoming more metabolically expensive. Many of the marine reptiles that had become so successful during the Triassic were initially buffered from these chemical changes by their vertebrate physiology. But as the organisms at the base of marine food webs began to struggle, the effects cascaded upward through entire ecosystems. Fish populations declined as their invertebrate prey became less abundant. Marine reptile populations found their food sources becoming scarce and unpredictable. The response to these challenges varied dramatically among different groups of marine organisms. Some species demonstrated remarkable resilience, developing new feeding strategies or physiological adaptations that allowed them to cope with changing conditions. Others proved more vulnerable, with entire lineages beginning to decline as their specialized adaptations became liabilities rather than advantages. The ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-like marine reptiles that had become such successful predators, showed mixed responses to the environmental pressures. Some lineages continued to thrive, their pursuit predator lifestyle proving adaptable to changing prey distributions. But others, particularly those that had become highly specialized for specific types of prey or particular marine environments, began to experience population declines. The placidonts, with their unique approach to marine herbivory, faced particular challenges as ocean acidification affected the shell-bearing mollusks that formed the core of their diet. Some species adapted by shifting to different prey types or modifying their feeding behaviors. Others found their specialized crushing apparatus less effective as their traditional food sources became scarce. But the marine realm wasn't the only environment experiencing pressure. On land, the changing climate was creating new challenges for terrestrial ecosystems that had become accustomed to the relatively stable conditions of the Middle Triassic. The increasing volcanic activity was periodically filling the atmosphere with ash and toxic gases, creating regional environmental crises that tested the adaptability of terrestrial organisms. The plant communities that formed the foundation of terrestrial food webs were particularly vulnerable to these atmospheric changes. Many coniferous forests, which had become dominant across vast areas of Pangaea, began to experience stress from increased temperature and atmospheric toxicity. Some plant species proved resilient, but others began to decline, creating cascading effects through entire ecosystems. The herbivorous animals that had evolved to exploit specific types of vegetation found themselves facing food shortages as their preferred plants became less abundant. Some species adapted by becoming more generalized in their feeding habits. Others migrated to areas where their preferred vegetation remained available. Still, others began to decline as their specialized digestive systems couldn't efficiently process alternative food sources. The predators that had built their success on hunting these herbivores faced their own set of challenges. As prey populations became less predictable and less abundant, predatory strategies that had been highly successful during the stable Middle Triassic became less effective. Some predators adapted by becoming more opportunistic, taking advantage of whatever prey was available. Others maintained their specialized hunting strategies, but found their populations declining along with their preferred prey. The archosaur groups that had dominated many terrestrial ecosystems during the Triassic showed varying degrees of resilience to these environmental pressures. Some, the massive of predators that had been apex hunters in their ecosystems, proved vulnerable to the ecological disruptions caused by changing prey availability. Their large size and high metabolic demands made them particularly sensitive to food shortages. Many of the crocodile-line archosaurs that had achieved such remarkable diversity during the Triassic began to experience population declines. The terrestrial species that had competed so successfully with early dinosaurs found their specialized adaptations becoming disadvantageous as environmental conditions became more unpredictable. The herbivorous forms that had evolved such efficient plant processing systems struggled as vegetation communities changed. But here's where the story takes another fascinating turn. The same environmental pressures that were challenging many established Triassic groups were creating new opportunities for other organisms. The declining abundance of dominant predators opened ecological niches that could be exploited by more adaptable species. The disruption of established vegetation communities created opportunities for plants with different ecological strategies. The early dinosaurs, which had remained relatively minor players throughout most of the Triassic, despite their impressive innovations, found themselves perfectly positioned to take advantage of these changing conditions. Their metabolic efficiency, behavioral flexibility, and diverse body plans gave them crucial advantages as environmental conditions became more unpredictable. While larger, more specialized predators struggled with declining prey availability, the smaller, more adaptable dinosaurs could switch between different food sources as circumstances required. Their efficient metabolisms allowed them to survive on less food during times of scarcity. Their behavioral flexibility enabled them to modify their hunting strategies as prey distributions changed. The social behaviors that many dinosaur species had developed also provided advantages during times of environmental stress. Group living allowed them to share information about food sources and environmental dangers. Cooperative hunting enabled them to take down larger prey than individual animals could handle alone. Extended parental care improved juvenile survival rates during difficult periods. But dinosaur success during the late Triassic environmental crisis wasn't just about individual adaptations. It was also about their diversity as a group. While some dinosaur lineages declined along with other Triassic animals, others expanded into vacant ecological niches. This diversity meant that dinosaurs as a whole were more resilient to environmental change than groups represented by fewer, more specialized species. The mammal-like reptiles that had played such important roles in early Triassic recovery also showed mixed responses to the changing environmental conditions. Some lineages, particularly the smaller, more behaviorally flexible species, continued to thrive. But many of the larger forms that had been successful predators and herbivores during the stable Middle Triassic began to decline. The dicynodonts, those pig-like herbivores that had been so successful after surviving the Great Dying, found their populations increasingly stressed by changes in vegetation communities. Some species adapted by modifying their feeding behaviors or expanding their dietary range. Others proved less adaptable and began to experience population declines that would eventually lead to extinction. The cynodonts, those advanced mammal-like reptiles that were the ancestors of true mammals, showed remarkable resilience during this period of environmental change. Their already sophisticated physiology and behavior provided them with the flexibility needed to cope with unpredictable conditions. Many lineages continued to evolve and diversify, setting the stage for the eventual emergence of true mammals. The first pterosaurs, which had achieved such remarkable success in aerial environments, also demonstrated considerable resilience to the environmental changes of the late Triassic. Their ability to travel long distances in search of food gave them advantages over more sedentary species. Their exploitation of aerial insects and small vertebrates provided them with food sources that remained relatively stable even as terrestrial and marine ecosystems were disrupted. Early turtles, with their conservative body plan and generalized lifestyle, proved remarkably resistant to the environmental pressures that were challenging more specialized groups. Their ability to exploit both terrestrial and aquatic resources gave them flexibility during times when individual ecosystems were under stress. Their protective shells provided defense against predators whose normal prey might be becoming scarce. The environmental changes of the late Triassic weren't uniform across the planet. Different regions experienced different degrees of volcanic activity, climate change, and ecological disruption. This geographic variation created a complex mosaic of environmental conditions that favored different types of organisms in different areas. Some regions remained relatively stable and continued to support diverse communities of Triassic organisms. Others experienced more severe disruptions that eliminated many established species while creating opportunities for more adaptable forms. Still others underwent intermediate levels of change that led to gradual shifts in community composition rather than sudden extinctions. The organisms that were most successful during this period of environmental transition shared several important characteristics. They tended to be generalists rather than specialists, capable of exploiting multiple food sources or habitat types. They were often smaller rather than larger, with lower metabolic demands that could be met even when resources were scarce. They frequently possessed behavioral flexibility that allowed them to modify their strategies as conditions changed. But perhaps most importantly, the successful species were those that belonged to diverse evolutionary lineages, groups represented by many species with different ecological adaptations were more likely to have at least some members survive environmental changes. Single species lineages or groups with very similar ecological strategies were more vulnerable to complete extinction. As the late Triassic progressed toward its end, the cumulative effects of environmental change began to reach a critical threshold. Ecosystems that had been gradually stressed by years of climate change and atmospheric disruption began to experience more dramatic collapses. Food webs that had been slowly simplified by species losses reached points where they could no longer maintain their basic structure. The marine realm experienced some of the most severe disruptions as ocean acidification and temperature changes finally overwhelmed the adaptive capacity of many organisms. Reef systems that had taken millions of years to rebuild were destroyed once again. Many lineages of marine reptiles that had been so successful during the Triassic radiation finally succumbed to the changing conditions. On land, the combination of climate change, atmospheric toxicity, and vegetation disruption created cascading effects that rippled through entire continental ecosystems. Many of the large predators and herbivores that had been dominant during the Middle Triassic disappeared entirely. Plant communities underwent major reorganizations that eliminated some species while favoring others. Yet, even as these dramatic changes were eliminating many Triassic groups, they were also creating unprecedented opportunities for the survivors' ecological niches that could be exploited. The extinction of dominant by smaller predators opened more adaptable species. The collapse of established vegetation communities created space for new types of plants to flourish. The end-Triassic extinction event that emerged from these accumulating environmental pressures was significant, but not as severe as the Great Dying that had ended the Permian. It eliminated perhaps 20 to 30% of marine species and a similar proportion of terrestrial vertebrates. While substantial, this level of extinction was far from the near-total biological collapse that had characterized the earlier event. More importantly, the pattern of extinction was highly selective. The species that disappeared were primarily those that had become highly specialized for particular environmental conditions or food sources. The survivors were predominantly generalist, behaviorally flexible species and members of diverse evolutionary lineages. This selectivity meant that the post-extinction world retained much of the biological innovation that had characterized the Triassic recovery. The fundamental ecosystem structures that had been developed during the period persisted, though often with different species filling key ecological roles. The complex food webs and intricate predator-prey relationships that had emerged from the Great Dying continued to function, though with modified species compositions. The dinosaurs emerged from the end-Triassic extinction as clear winners. With many of their archosaur competitors eliminated, they found themselves in a position to exploit ecological niches that had previously been occupied by other groups. Their diversity, adaptability, and efficiency had positioned them perfectly to take advantage of the new opportunities created by the extinction. The early mammals also benefited from the selective nature of the extinction. Their small size, behavioral flexibility, and generalized lifestyle had protected them from the environmental pressures that eliminated many larger, more specialized species. They entered the Jurassic period with expanded opportunities and reduced competition. Many marine groups showed similar patterns of selective survival. The most adaptable ichthyosaurs persisted and would go on to achieve even greater success during the Jurassic. The most generalized marine reptiles continued to thrive in post-extinction oceans. The coral species that had proven most resistant to ocean acidification became the foundation for new reef systems. The end Triassic extinction marked the end of one of the most remarkable periods in Earth's history. The 50 million years of the Triassic had seen life transform from near total devastation to spectacular diversity. Organisms had pioneered new approaches to existence that would influence biological evolution for hundreds of millions of years. Ecosystems had developed levels of complexity that exceeded anything that had existed before the Great Dying. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Triassic wasn't any particular group of organisms or any specific ecosystem structure. It was the demonstration that life possesses an almost incredible capacity for innovation and recovery. The period showed that catastrophic extinctions, while devastating in the short term, can create opportunities for evolutionary experimentation on scales that would be impossible under more stable conditions. The innovations that emerged during the Triassic recovery didn't just allow life to rebuild what had been lost. They created entirely new possibilities for biological diversity that expanded the very definition of what it meant to be alive on planet Earth. The organisms that survived the end Triassic extinction carried with them the accumulated innovations of 50 million years of evolutionary experimentation. As we look forward from the end of the Triassic to the beginning of the Jurassic period, we see a world poised for another great evolutionary radiation. The dinosaurs that had emerged as winners from the extinction would diversify into forms that would dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 150 million years. The mammals would begin their own remarkable evolutionary journey toward eventual dominance. The marine reptiles would achieve sizes and sophistication that would make them among the most spectacular predators ever to exist. But all of these future developments would be built on the foundation established during the Triassic recovery. The period had demonstrated that life's response to catastrophe isn't just about survival. It's about transformation, innovation, and the endless creativity of evolution when given the opportunity to explore new possibilities. The Triassic period stands as one of the most remarkable chapters in the 4 billion-year story of life on Earth. It showed us what's possible when life is given a blank slate and challenged to rebuild from almost nothing. The organisms that emerged from this process weren't just survivors. They were pioneers of entirely new approaches to existence that would shape biological diversity for geological ages to come. From the ashes of the worst extinction in Earth's history had risen a biological world more diverse, more complex, and more spectacular than anything that had existed before. The dawn of the dinosaurs was just the beginning of a story that would see life reach heights of diversity and sophistication that continue to amaze us today. The Triassic had proven that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, life not only finds a way to survive, but to flourish in ways more remarkable than ever before. The post-apocalyptic world that had greeted the first Triassic survivors had been transformed into a vibrant, thriving planet, ready to support some of the most extraordinary creatures our world has ever known. The age of dinosaurs was about to begin in earnest, built on a foundation of innovation, resilience, and evolutionary creativity that had emerged from the greatest catastrophe in Earth's history. The transformation that would define the early Jurassic was already underway as the dust settled from the end Triassic extinction. But this wasn't just another routine ecological transition. What was real domen, very nature of terrestance, a changing of the guard that would establish a fundamental shift in the happening, represent patterns of life that persist to this day. Picture the world as it existed in those crucial first few million years after the extinction. The landscape was dotted with the remnants of once thriving communities, but it was also alive with unprecedented opportunity. Ecological niches that had been occupied by the same types of creatures for tens of millions of years were suddenly vacant, waiting for new tenants with fresh approaches to survival and success. The dinosaurs that stepped into this transformed world were no longer the scrappy underdogs they had been throughout most of the Triassic. The selective pressures of the extinction had eliminated many of their most formidable competitors, leaving them in a position to finally demonstrate the full potential of their evolutionary innovations. And demonstrate it they did, in ways that would reshape the entire character of terrestrial ecosystems. But here's what makes this transition so fascinating. The dinosaurs didn't simply expand into vacant ecological roles and continue doing what they had always done. Instead, they began experimenting with body plans and lifestyles that pushed the boundaries of what vertebrate life could achieve. The metabolic efficiency and behavioral flexibility that had kept them alive during the Triassic now became launching pads for evolutionary innovations that would have seemed impossible just a few million years earlier. Some dinosaur lineages began exploring the upper limits of terrestrial body size, developing forms that dwarfed even the largest Triassic predators. These weren't just scaled-up versions of their ancestors. They were creatures that required entirely new approaches to biomechanics, circulation, and behavior. The engineering challenges of supporting massive bodies on land pushed dinosaur evolution in directions that revealed new possibilities for vertebrate design. Other dinosaur groups went in completely different directions, becoming smaller, more agile, and increasingly sophisticated in their behavioral repertoires. These creatures developed hunting strategies and social behaviors that were far more complex than anything seen in their Triassic predecessors. They pioneered new approaches to communication, cooperation, and environmental exploitation that would influence vertebrate evolution for hundreds of millions of years. the herbivorous dinosaurs underwent their own remarkable radiation, developing feeding strategies that allowed them to process plant material more efficiently than any terrestrial herbivores that had come before. Some evolved elaborate dental batteries that could grind tough vegetation into digestible particles. Others developed massive gut systems that could extract nutrients from low-quality plant material through extended fermentation processes. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early Jurassic dinosaur evolution was the speed at which it occurred. Within just a few million years of the end Triassic extinction, dinosaur diversity had exploded to levels that exceeded anything seen during the entire Triassic period. New species were appearing at rates that suggested evolution was operating in overdrive, exploring possibilities that had been constrained by competition during more crowded times. This rapid diversification wasn't happening in isolation. The plant communities that formed the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems were also undergoing dramatic changes as the climate continued to warm and atmospheric composition shifted. New types of vegetation were appearing that offered different nutritional profiles and growth patterns than the plants that had dominated Triassic landscapes. The relationship between evolving plant communities and diversifying dinosaur herbivores created positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of change throughout terrestrial ecosystems. As dinosaurs developed new feeding strategies, they created new selective pressures on plants. As plants evolved new defensive or nutritional strategies, they created new opportunities for herbivore specialization. The predatory dinosaurs were responding to these changes with their own innovations. The increasing diversity and abundance of herbivorous prey created opportunities for predatory specialization that hadn't existed during the Triassic. Some predators evolved for hunting specific types of prey, developing specialized anatomical and behavioral adaptations that made them incredibly effective against particular targets. Other predatory dinosaurs maintained more generalized hunting strategies, but improved their effectiveness through increased size, better sensory systems, or more sophisticated social behaviors. The result was the development of predatory guilds that were more diverse and more complex than anything that had existed during the Triassic recovery period. The marine realm was experiencing its own post-extinction renaissance, though the patterns were somewhat different from what was happening on land. The ichthyosaurs that had survived the end Triassic extinction began an evolutionary radiation that would produce some of the most spectacular marine predators of all time. These creatures were exploring the upper limits of what was possible for air-breathing vertebrates living in aquatic environments. Some ichthyosaur lineages developed body sizes that rivaled modern whales, becoming open-ocean giants capable of taking prey that would have been impossible for their Triassic ancestors to handle. Others remained smaller, but developed incredibly sophisticated sensory systems and hunting strategies that made them supremely effective predators in their marine environments. The success of ichthyosaurs was paralleled by the radiation of other marine reptile groups that had survived the extinction. Plesiosaurs, with their unique combination of large bodies and long necks, were developing into some of the most unusual predators ever to exist. Their feeding strategies and ecological roles were unlike anything seen in modern oceans, representing evolutionary experiments that would persist for over 100 million years. But the marine innovations weren't limited to large, charismatic predators. Throughout the early Jurassic oceans, smaller organisms were also undergoing rapid evolutionary change. The ammonoids that had survived the extinction continued their remarkable diversification, developing shell forms and ecological strategies that pushed the boundaries of what was possible for cephalopod life. The coral reefs that had been so severely damaged by the end Triassic extinction began rebuilding once again, but with new species compositions that reflected the selective nature of the extinction event. The most resilient coral species became the foundation for reef systems that would eventually rival their Triassic predecessors in complexity and productivity. These recovering marine ecosystems created opportunities for the evolution of entirely new types of marine communities. Fish populations diversified rapidly as coral reefs provided new habitat types and feeding opportunities. Marine invertebrates evolved new strategies for exploiting the three-dimensional structures created by coral growth. The success of these marine recovery efforts had important implications for terrestrial ecosystems as well. Coastal environments became more productive as marine nutrients were transported inland through various processes. The increasing diversity of marine life created new opportunities for the few vertebrates that could exploit both terrestrial and marine resources. The pterosaurs, which had weathered the end Triassic extinction quite successfully, began their own remarkable evolutionary radiation during the early Jurassic. These flying reptiles were exploring new approaches to aerial life that would eventually produce some of the largest flying animals ever to exist. Their success in aerial environments was opening up ecological niches that had never been exploited by vertebrates before. Some pterosaur lineages developed specialized feeding strategies for exploiting marine resources while maintaining their terrestrial breeding habits. Others evolved for more terrestrial lifestyles, becoming aerial predators that could hunt small dinosaurs and other land-dwelling animals. Still others developed feeding strategies that allowed them to exploit plant resources directly, becoming some of the first vertebrate aerial herbivores. The mammals that had survived the end Triassic extinction were also beginning to show signs of the evolutionary potential that would eventually make them dominant terrestrial vertebrates. During the Triassic, mammals had remained small nocturnal creatures that occupied relatively marginal ecological roles. But the post-extinction world offered new opportunities for mammalian diversification. Some early Jurassic mammals began exploring slightly larger body sizes and more varied ecological strategies. Others developed more sophisticated sensory systems and behavioral repertoires that allowed them to exploit resources more effectively. While they remained relatively small and inconspicuous compared to the dinosaurs, mammals were quietly accumulating the innovations that would eventually enable their own evolutionary success. The cynodonts that gave rise to true mammals continued their own evolutionary trajectory, developing increasingly sophisticated physiological and behavioral adaptations. Their advanced metabolism, improved sensory systems, and complex social behaviors were creating the foundation for mammalian success that would become evident in later geological periods. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early Jurassic evolution was how all of these different groups were interacting to create ecosystem structures of unprecedented complexity. The simple food webs that had characterized the immediate post-extinction recovery were giving way to intricate networks of ecological relationships that involved dozens of species in complex predator-prey, competitive, and cooperative interactions. These complex ecosystems were more stable and more productive than the simpler communities that had existed during the early phases of Triassic recovery. They could support larger numbers of species and more specialized ecological strategies. They were also more resilient to environmental perturbations, with multiple species capable of filling similar ecological roles if any particular species declined or went extinct. The geographic scope of these ecological developments was truly global. Similar patterns of post-extinction recovery and diversification were occurring on all continents, though with regional variations that reflected different environmental conditions and evolutionary histories. The ongoing breakup of Pangaea was creating new geographic barriers and new opportunities for evolutionary divergence. The separation of continental masses was beginning to isolate populations of widespread species, creating opportunities for allopatric speciation that would eventually contribute to global biodiversity. Different regions were developing their own distinctive faunal assemblages as geographic isolation combined with local environmental conditions to drive evolutionary divergence. The climate of the early Jurassic was generally warmer and more humid than what we experience today, creating environmental conditions that supported high levels of biological productivity and diversity. The absence of polar ice caps and the high levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide created greenhouse conditions that extended warm climates far toward the poles. These climatic conditions supported the development of lush forests across vast areas of the planet. Coniferous trees dominated many regions, but ferns, cycads, and other plant groups also achieved considerable success. The high productivity of these plant communities provided the foundation for the diverse herbivore communities that were supporting equally diverse predator assemblages. The success of early Jurassic ecosystems wasn't just about individual species becoming more successful or diverse. It was about the emergence of entirely new approaches to ecosystem organization and function. The biological innovations that had emerged during the Triassic recovery were being refined and expanded into ecosystem structures that would persist for over 100 million years. The predator-prey relationships that developed during the early Jurassic were more sophisticated than anything that had existed during the Triassic. Predators and prey were engaged in evolutionary arms races that drove rapid innovation in hunting strategies, defensive behaviors, and ecological specialization. These interactions created selective pressures that accelerated evolutionary change throughout entire communities. The herbivore communities of the early Jurassic were also more complex than their Triassic predecessors. Different species had evolved to exploit different aspects of plant resources, reducing competition while maximizing the utilization of available plant material. Some specialized on particular plant types, others on specific plant tissues, and still others on plants at different stages of growth or seasonal availability. This herbivore diversification created opportunities for predatory specialization that hadn't existed during simpler times. Some predators evolved to hunt specific types of herbivores, developing anatomical and behavioral adaptations that made them incredibly effective against particular prey species. Others remained generalists, but improved their hunting effectiveness through increased size, better sensory systems, or more sophisticated social behaviors. The scavenging communities that developed during the early Jurassic were also more complex than those of the Triassic. The larger body sizes achieved by some predators and herbivores created carcasses that could support diverse communities of scavenging organisms. Different scavenger species specialized on different aspects of carcass utilization, creating complex networks of resource exploitation. These scavenging communities played crucial roles in ecosystem nutrient cycling and energy flow. They ensured that the energy invested in large body sizes wasn't lost when animals died, but was instead recycled through the ecosystem to support other organisms. This efficient nutrient recycling contributed to the high productivity that characterized early Jurassic ecosystems. The social behaviors that evolved during this period were also more sophisticated than anything seen during the Triassic. Many species developed complex communication systems, cooperative hunting strategies, and elaborate parental care behaviors. These social innovations provided advantages that were particularly important in the competitive environment of early Jurassic ecosystems. Some dinosaur species developed highly coordinated group hunting behaviors that allowed them to take down prey much larger than any individual could handle alone. Others evolved complex territorial behaviors that enabled them to defend resources more effectively. Still others developed cooperative breeding strategies that improved offspring survival in dangerous environments. The parental care behaviors of early Jurassic animals were particularly advanced compared to their Triassic predecessors. Many species invested considerable time and energy in caring for their young, teaching them essential skills and protecting them during vulnerable developmental stages. This extended parental care improved juvenile survival rates and allowed for the development of more complex behavioral repertoires. These behavioral innovations weren't limited to large, charismatic species. Even smaller animals developed sophisticated strategies for communication, resource acquisition, and predator avoidance. The result was the emergence of animal communities that were characterized by behavioral complexity that had rarely been achieved during the Triassic. The early Jurassic also saw the development of some of the first truly sophisticated migration behaviors among terrestrial vertebrates. Some species developed seasonal migration patterns that allowed them to exploit resources that were available at different times and in different places. These migrations created complex temporal dynamics in ecosystem structure and function. The seasonal movements of large herbivores created pulses of nutrients and disturbance that influenced plant community composition and productivity. The predators that followed these migrating herds developed their own complex movement patterns that linked distant ecosystems through predator-prey interactions. These migration patterns also contributed to gene flow between distant populations, reducing the likelihood of local extinctions and maintaining genetic diversity within species. The result was the development of species that were more resilient to local environmental perturbations and better able to persist through changing conditions. As we look at the totality of early Jurassic ecosystem development, we see patterns that would persist for the next 150 million years of dinosaur dominance. The basic ecological structures, the fundamental approaches to predator-prey interactions, and the essential strategies for resource exploitation had all been established during this crucial period of post-extinction recovery and innovation. The success of these early Jurassic ecosystems demonstrates something profound about evolution's capacity for innovation following major extinction events. The elimination of established ecological structures doesn't just create opportunities for simple replacement. It creates opportunities for the development of entirely new approaches to ecosystem organization that can be more successful than what existed before. The organisms that inherited the post-Triassic world didn't just rebuild what had been lost. They pioneered new approaches to terrestrial and marine life that expanded the very definition of what was possible for biological communities. The innovations that emerged during this period would influence ecosystem structure and function for geological ages to come. The early Jurassic marked the true beginning of the Mesozoic era's characteristic biological diversity. The dinosaurs had finally achieved their potential as dominant terrestrial vertebrates. The marine reptiles were reaching levels of diversity and sophistication that would make them among the most successful marine predators of all time. The mammals were accumulating the innovations that would eventually enable their own evolutionary success. But perhaps most importantly, the early Jurassic established the ecological foundation that would support some of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. The complex ecosystems that emerged during this period created the environmental conditions necessary for the evolution of truly gigantic terrestrial animals, sophisticated predatory behaviors, and ecological relationships of unprecedented complexity. The world that had emerged from the ashes of the end Triassic extinction was more biologically diverse, more ecologically complex, and more evolutionarily dynamic than anything that had existed before. The innovations that had begun during the Triassic recovery had been refined and expanded into ecosystem structures that would define biological diversity for over 100 million years. As we prepare to witness the full flowering of dinosaur diversity during the Middle and Late Jurassic, we can see how the foundation established during the post-extinction recovery made all of these future developments possible. The metabolic innovations, behavioral sophistication, and ecological strategies that had emerged during the Triassic and early Jurassic would be the building blocks for some of the most remarkable creatures our planet has ever known. The age of dinosaurs had truly begun built on a foundation of Rizal, had transformiance, innovation, and evolutionary creativity. That a post-apocalyptic wasteland into the most spectacularly diverse biological world our planet had yet produced. The journey from the Great Dying to the early Jurassic radiation represents one of the most remarkable chapters in the 4-billion-year story of life on Earth, demonstrating that catastrophe and recovery are not just destructive and reconstructive forces, but creative processes that can generate entirely new possibilities for biological existence. The stage was now set for the next great chapter in Earth's biological history, one that would see the innovations of the Triassic recovery reach their full potential, so successful that they would capture in creatures so magnificent and the human imagination hundreds of millions of years after their extinction. The dawn of the dinosaurs was complete, and the age of giants was about to begin. The early Jurassic world that emerged from the ashes of the end-Triassic extinction was about to witness transformations that would dwarf even the remarkable innovations we've already explored. The dinosaurs had secured their foothold, but what came next would redefine the very concept of what life could achieve on our planet. We're talking about evolutionary experiments so audacious, so breathtakingly ambitious, that they would create creatures unlike anything that had ever existed before or since. But before we dive into these spectacular developments, let's take a moment to appreciate just how profoundly the world had already changed. The landscapes that greeted the early Jurassic pioneers bore little resemblance to the devastated wastelands of the early Triassic. Lush forests stretched across continents, their canopies alive with the calls of pterosaurs and the rustle of small dinosaurs moving through the undergrowth. Rivers teemed with fish and marine reptiles, while shallow seas supported reef systems that were beginning to rival anything that had existed before the Great Dying. Yet, even as these communities flourished, the underlying geological forces that had shaped the Triassic world continued their relentless work. Pangaea was slowly but inexorably tearing itself apart, creating new ocean basins and fundamentally altering global climate patterns. The massive supercontinent that had dominated Earth's geography for hundreds of millions of years was entering its final phase, and the breakup would create opportunities for biological innovation on scales that were almost impossible to imagine. As the continents began to separate, they carried with them populations of organisms that would soon find themselves isolated on different land masses. This geographic isolation would prove to be one of the most powerful drivers of evolutionary change during the Jurassic period. Species that had once been connected by continuous populations suddenly found themselves separated by growing ocean basins, creating opportunities for independent evolutionary trajectories that would generate unprecedented levels of biological diversity. The climate changes that accompanied continental breakup were equally dramatic. The formation of new ocean basins altered global circulation patterns, creating more complex and regionally variable climate systems. Some areas became warmer and more humid, supporting the development of tropical forests, unlike anything seen during the Triassic. Others experienced more seasonal climates that created new challenges and opportunities for terrestrial life. These changing environmental conditions provided the perfect backdrop for one of the most spectacular evolutionary radiations in Earth's history. The dinosaurs that had emerged as winners from the end Triassic extinction were about to demonstrate just how creative evolution could be when given the right combination of opportunity and environmental pressure. The results would be creatures so magnificent and so varied that they would dominate terrestrial ecosystems for the next 135 million years. The herbivorous dinosaurs were among the first to show signs of the evolutionary explosion that was coming. During the Triassic, plant-eating dinosaurs had been relatively small creatures with fairly generalized feeding strategies. But as Jurassic plant communities became more diverse and productive, herbivorous dinosaurs began exploring new approaches to plant consumption that would revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems. Some lineages began experimenting with truly massive body sizes, developing forms that could reach heights of 20 meters or more. These weren't just scaled-up versions of their ancestors. They were engineering marvels that required entirely new solutions to the challenges of supporting enormous bodies on land. Their necks became incredibly long, allowing them to browse on vegetation that was completely inaccessible to other terrestrial animals. Their digestive systems became massive fermentation chambers capable of extracting nutrients from even the toughest plant material. The biomechanical challenges of supporting such enormous bodies pushed dinosaur evolution in directions that revealed new possibilities for vertebrate design. These giants developed specialized air-filled bones that reduced their weight without sacrificing strength. They evolved complex respiratory systems that could efficiently oxygenate their massive bodies. They developed sophisticated circulatory systems that could pump blood to heights that would challenge the laws of physics. But size wasn't the only direction that herbivorous dinosaurs explored. Other lineages remained smaller, but developed increasingly sophisticated feeding mechanisms that allowed them to process plant material more efficiently than any terrestrial herbivores that had come before. Some evolved elaborate dental batteries containing hundreds of teeth that could grind tough vegetation into easily digestible particles. Others developed powerful jaw muscles and specialized teeth that could slice through even the most fibrous plant material. The diversity of feeding strategies that emerged among Jurassic herbivores created opportunities for multiple species to coexist in the same environments without directly competing for the same resources. Some specialized on tree foliage, others on ferns and cycads, and still others on the tough, woody stems of conifers. This resource partitioning allowed herbivore communities to achieve levels of diversity that had never been seen before in terrestrial ecosystems. The success of these herbivorous innovations had profound effects on plant communities themselves. The intense browsing pressure created by diverse dinosaur herbivores drove the evolution of new defensive strategies among plants. Some species evolved chemical defenses that made them toxic or unpalatable to herbivores. Others developed physical defenses like spines, tough bark, or rapid growth that allowed them to escape herbivore pressure. The co-evolutionary arms race between plants and herbivorous dinosaurs created positive feedback loops that accelerated evolutionary change throughout terrestrial ecosystems. As plants evolved new defenses, herbivores developed new feeding strategies to overcome those defenses. As herbivores became more diverse and abundant, plants evolved increasingly sophisticated ways to avoid being consumed. These plant-herbivore interactions were creating ecosystem dynamics that were fundamentally different from anything that had existed during the Triassic. The simple communities of the post-extinction recovery were giving way to intricate webs of coevolutionary relationships that involved dozens of species in complex interactions spanning multiple trophic levels. Meanwhile, the predatory dinosaurs were undergoing their own spectacular radiation, driven by the increasing diversity and abundance of potential prey. The small, agile predators that had been typical during the Triassic were joined by increasingly large and powerful forms that could take down even the most massive herbivores. These weren't just bigger versions of their ancestors. They were specialized killing machines that had evolved sophisticated strategies for hunting prey many times their own size. Some predatory lineages developed incredible speed and agility, becoming pursuit predators that could run down even the fastest herbivores across open terrain. Others evolved for ambush hunting, developing powerful limbs and massive jaws that could deliver devastating attacks from concealment. Still others became pack hunters, developing complex social behaviors that allowed groups to coordinate attacks on prey that would be impossible for any individual to handle alone. The arms race between predators and prey during the Jurassic period drove innovations that pushed both groups to extremes that seem almost impossible by modern standards. Some herbivores developed armor plating that could deflect even the most powerful predatory attacks. Others evolved defensive behaviors and social structures that provided protection through group vigilance and mutual defense. The predators responded with their own innovations. Some developed incredibly powerful jaws and teeth that could penetrate even the toughest armor. Others evolved hunting strategies that could overcome group defenses through coordination and persistence. Still others developed sensory systems that could detect prey even when they were trying to hide or escape. These predator-prey dynamics were creating selective pressures that drove rapid evolutionary change throughout dinosaur communities. Species were locked in evolutionary arms races that generated innovation at rates that were unprecedented in terrestrial ecosystems. The result was the emergence of dinosaur communities that were more diverse, more specialized, and more ecologically complex than anything that had existed before. The social behaviors that evolved among Jurassic dinosaurs were particularly remarkable. Many species developed complex communication systems that allowed them to coordinate group activities with remarkable precision. Some herbivores evolved elaborate warning systems that could alert entire herds to the presence of predators. Others developed dominance hierarchies that determined access to prime feeding areas and mating opportunities. The predatory dinosaurs were equally innovative in their social behaviors. Some species developed sophisticated pack hunting strategies that required complex coordination and communication between group members. Others evolved territorial behaviors that allowed them to defend prime hunting grounds from competitors. Still others developed cooperative breeding strategies that improved offspring survival in dangerous environments. These behavioral innovations weren't limited to large, charismatic species. Even smaller dinosaurs developed sophisticated strategies for communication, resource acquisition, and predator avoidance. The result was the emergence of dinosaur communities that were characterized by behavioral complexity that had rarely been achieved in terrestrial ecosystems. The parental care behaviors of Jurassic dinosaurs were particularly advanced compared to what had been seen during the Triassic. Many species invested considerable time and energy in caring for their young, building elaborate nests, defending territories, and teaching essential survival skills. Some species even developed cooperative parenting strategies where multiple adults worked together to raise young. This extended parental care had profound effects on dinosaur evolution and ecology. It allowed for the development of more complex behavioral repertoires that could be learned rather than just inherited. It improved juvenile survival rates in dangerous environments. It created opportunities for cultural transmission of behaviors and knowledge between generations. The nesting behaviors of Jurassic dinosaurs were particularly sophisticated. Some species built elaborate communal nesting sites that were used by multiple individuals over many generations. Others developed complex incubation behaviors that ensured optimal conditions for egg development. Still others evolved protective strategies that guarded nests from predators and environmental hazards. These reproductive innovations contributed to the success of dinosaur communities by ensuring that each generation was well prepared for the challenges of life in Jurassic ecosystems. The combination of sophisticated parental care, complex social behaviors, and advanced communication systems created dinosaur societies that were more resilient and more adaptable than anything that had existed during the Triassic. The geographic expansion of dinosaurs during the Jurassic was equally impressive. As Pangaea continued to break apart, dinosaur populations spread across the newly forming continents, adapting to local environmental conditions and evolving into regionally distinct forms. This geographic diversification contributed to the overall diversity of dinosaur communities and created opportunities for evolutionary experimentation that wouldn't have been possible on a single, unified landmass. Different regions developed their own characteristic dinosaur faunas, reflecting local environmental conditions and evolutionary histories. Some areas became dominated by massive, long-necked herbivores and the large predators that hunted them. Others were characterized by smaller, more agile forms that were adapted for life in dense forests or open woodlands. The isolation of populations on different continents also created opportunities for independent evolutionary trajectories that generated remarkable diversity within dinosaur lineages. Related species on different continents evolved different solutions to similar ecological challenges, demonstrating the creative potential of evolution when populations are allowed to diverge independently. But the innovations weren't limited to terrestrial environments. The marine realm was experiencing its own spectacular radiation of reptilian predators that would make the Jurassic oceans some of the most dangerous waters in Earth's history. The ichthyosaurs that had survived the end Triassic extinction were evolving into forms that pushed the boundaries of what was possible for air-breathing marine predators. Some ichthyosaur lineages achieved body sizes that rivaled modern whales, becoming oceanic giants capable of diving to incredible depths and hunting prey that would have been impossible for their ancestors to handle. These massive marine reptiles developed sophisticated echolocation systems, powerful propulsion mechanisms, and hunting strategies that made them supremely effective in their aquatic environments. The success of these giant ichthyosaurs was paralleled by the evolution of other marine reptile groups that were exploring different approaches to aquatic predation. The plesiosaurs were developing their own unique combination of large bodies, long necks, and specialized feeding strategies that would make them among the most unusual predators ever to exist. Some plesiosaur species evolved necks that contained over 70 vertebrae, creating appendages that were longer than the rest of their bodies combined. These extraordinary necks allowed them to strike at prey from distances that would have been impossible for more conventional predators, creating hunting strategies that were unlike anything seen in modern oceans. Other plesiosaur lineages went in different directions, developing shorter necks but more powerful bodies and larger heads. These forms became active pursuit predators that could chase down fast-moving prey in open water. Their powerful flippers and streamlined bodies made them incredibly effective hunters that could compete in more environments. The diversity of marine reptile successfully, with ICHD complex predatory gill forms that evolved during the Jurassic ichthyosaurs and marine sophisticated than anything that had existed during the Triassic. Different species specialized on different prey types and different hunting strategies, creating opportunities for multiple large predators to coexist in the same marine environments. The success of these marine reptiles had profound effects on marine ecosystem structure. Fish populations had to develop new escape strategies and defensive behaviors to avoid these sophisticated predators. Marine invertebrates evolved new ways of avoiding detection and capture. The entire dynamics of marine predation were being rewritten by these remarkable hunters. The ammonoids that had survived the end Triassic extinction were also undergoing their own spectacular radiation, developing shell forms and ecological strategies that were more diverse than anything that had been seen during the Triassic. Some species evolved shells that were tightly coiled for maximum strength, while others developed loosely coiled or even straight shells that provided hydrodynamic advantages. The suture patterns that marked where internal chamber walls met the shell exterior became increasingly complex, creating structures that were both incredibly strong and surprisingly lightweight. These innovations allowed ammonoids to achieve larger sizes and more active lifestyles than their ancestors, making them important components of Jurassic marine ecosystems. The success of ammonoids during the Jurassic demonstrates the continued importance of cephalopods in marine ecosystems. These intelligent, active predators filled ecological niches that were crucial for maintaining the complex food webs that characterized Jurassic oceans. Their diversity and abundance made them important prey for larger marine reptiles, while they themselves preyed on fish and marine invertebrates. The coral reefs that were rebuilding during the Jurassic were also becoming more complex and more productive than their Triassic predecessors. The coral species that had survived the end Triassic extinction were diversifying rapidly, creating reef systems that supported incredibly diverse communities of marine organisms. These reef communities were becoming centers of evolutionary innovation, generating new species at remarkable rates. The three-dimensional complexity created by coral growth provided numerous microhabitats that could support specialized species with unique ecological requirements. The high productivity of reef systems created abundant resources that could sustain large populations of diverse organisms. Fish communities associated with Jurassic reefs were particularly diverse, developing feeding strategies that exploited every available resource within the reef environment. Some species became specialized coral feeders, others evolved for hunting small invertebrates, and still others became cleaners that removed parasites from larger fish. The success of reef ecosystems during the Jurassic had important implications for marine productivity and diversity. These systems became engines of evolutionary innovation that generated biological diversity at rates that exceeded those of most other marine environments. The complex food webs and intricate ecological relationships that characterized reef communities created stable ecosystems that could persist for millions of years. Meanwhile, in the skies above both terrestrial and marine environments, the pterosaurs were undergoing their own remarkable evolutionary radiation. These flying reptiles were exploring new approaches to aerial life that would eventually produce some of the largest flying animals ever to exist. Their success in aerial environments was opening up ecological niches that had never been exploited by vertebrates before. Some pterosaur lineages were developing specialized feeding strategies for exploiting marine resources while maintaining their terrestrial breeding habits. They evolved long, narrow beaks filled with sharp teeth that were perfect for catching fish from the surface of the water. Their flight capabilities allowed them to travel vast distances in search of productive fishing areas. Other pterosaur species were adapting for more terrestrial lifestyles, becoming aerial predators that could hunt small dinosaurs and other land-dwelling animals. Some developed powerful talons and hunting behaviors that were similar to modern birds of prey. Others evolved for scavenging, developing keen eyesight and flight capabilities that allowed them to locate and exploit carcasses across vast territories. The diversity of pterosaur forms that evolved during the Jurassic was truly remarkable. Some species remained small and agile, perfect for catching insects and other small prey. Others grew to impressive sizes, with wingspans that exceeded those of any modern flying animals. Still others developed specialized anatomical features that allowed them to exploit particular types of food resources. The success of pterosaurs during the Jurassic demonstrates the continued importance of aerial environments in vertebrate evolution. These flying reptiles were pioneers of three-dimensional ecosystem utilization, creating predator-prey relationships and resource exploitation strategies that added vertical complexity to both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The mammals that had survived the end Triassic extinction were also showing signs of evolutionary innovation, though they remained relatively small and inconspicuous compared to the dinosaurs and marine reptiles. Some mammalian lineages were beginning to explore slightly larger body sizes and more varied ecological strategies, setting the stage for evolutionary developments that would become more significant in later periods. Early Jurassic mammals were developing increasingly sophisticated sensory systems that allowed them to exploit resources that were unavailable to other vertebrates. Their enhanced hearing, smell, and touch capabilities gave them advantages in nocturnal environments where visual cues were less reliable. These sensory innovations were laying the groundwork for mammalian success that would become evident millions of years later. The social behaviors of early mammals were also becoming more complex, with some species developing cooperative behaviors and extended parental care that improved offspring survival rates. These behavioral innovations were creating the foundation for mammalian societies that would eventually become among the most sophisticated on Earth. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jurassic evolution was how all of these different groups were interacting to create ecosystem structures of unprecedented complexity and stability. The simple food webs that had characterized the post-extinction recovery were giving way to intricate networks of ecological relationships that involved hundreds of species in complex interactions spanning multiple environments and trophic levels. The terrestrial ecosystems of the Jurassic were characterized by predator-prey relationships, competitive interactions, and cooperative behaviors that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed during the Triassics. The large herbivorous dinosaurs were creating environmental modifications that affected plant communities, soil development, and even local climate patterns. Their massive size and high population densities made them ecosystem engineers that shaped the environments they inhabited. The predatory dinosaurs were responding to these herbivore-driven environmental changes with their own innovations. Some species developed specialized hunting strategies for particular habitats or prey types. Others maintained more generalized approaches but improved their effectiveness through behavioral flexibility and social cooperation. The marine ecosystems of the Jurassic were equally complex, with multiple levels of predators and prey creating food webs that were more intricate than anything seen in modern oceans. The large marine reptiles were apex predators that influenced the behavior and evolution of all other marine organisms. Their presence created selective pressures that drove innovation throughout entire marine communities. The success of Jurassic ecosystems wasn't just about individual species becoming more successful or diverse. It was about the emergence of ecological structures and processes that were more efficient, more stable, and more resilient than anything that had existed before. The biological innovations that had emerged during the Triassic recovery were being refined and expanded into ecosystem functions that would persist for over 100 million years. As we witness this spectacular flowering of biological diversity during the Middle Jurassic, we begin to see patterns that would define life on Earth for the rest of the Mesozoic era. The innovations in body size, feeding strategies, social behaviors, and ecological relationships that were emerging during this period would provide the foundation for some of the most remarkable evolutionary developments in Earth's history. The stage was set for even more spectacular innovations as the Jurassic period progressed toward its climax. The creatures that were evolving during this time weren't just successful in their own right. They were pioneers of biological possibilities that would influence evolution for hundreds of millions of years. The age of dinosaurs had reached its stride, and what was coming next would surpass even the remarkable achievements we've already witnessed. The world that emerged from the Middle Jurassic was poised to support evolutionary experiments so ambitious and so successful that they would create creatures of almost mythical proportions. Giants were about to walk the earth. Marine monsters would rule the seas, and the skies would be filled with flying reptiles of incredible sophistication and size. The biological revolution that had begun with the Triassic recovery was entering its most spectacular phase, one that would demonstrate the full creative potential of evolution when given the perfect combination of opportunity, environmental stability, and evolutionary time. The giants that were about to emerge from this evolutionary crucible would redefine the very concept of what was possible for life on land. We're not just talking about animals that were slightly larger than their predecessors. We're talking about creatures so massive, so architecturally ambitious, that they would challenge the fundamental laws of physics and engineering that govern terrestrial existence. Picture this moment in Earth's history when the first truly colossal herbivores began their transformation from merely large animals into living insects. These weren't gray scrapers datul changes happening over millions of years. The fossil record suggests that some lineages were achieving dramatic size increases in relatively short geological time frames, as if evolution had suddenly discovered the secret to building vertebrates on a scale that had never been attempted before. The engineering challenges these creatures had to overcome were staggering. Imagine trying to pump blood 40 feet up a vertical column to reach a brain positioned at the top of an impossibly long neck. The heart required to accomplish this feat would need to be massive, yet it couldn't be so large that it consumed all available space within the body cavity. The solution that evolved was nothing short of brilliant. Multiple hearts working in sequence, each one boosting blood pressure just enough to push vital fluids to the next level. But blood circulation was just one of dozens of biomechanical puzzles that had to be solved simultaneously. The skeletal system needed to support weights that approached the theoretical limits of what bone and cartilage could handle. The solution involved revolutionary changes to bone architecture, creating structures that were simultaneously incredibly strong and surprisingly lightweight. These bones developed complex internal networks of air spaces that reduced weight while maintaining structural integrity. The respiratory systems of these giants represented another masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. Moving air through bodies the size of small buildings required breathing mechanisms that were far more sophisticated than anything seen in smaller animals. These creatures developed respiratory systems with multiple air sacs throughout their bodies, creating breathing patterns that were more efficient than those of any modern animal. The digestive systems required to fuel these enormous bodies were equally impressive. These animals needed to process hundreds of pounds of plant material every day, extracting enough nutrients to maintain their massive bulk while supporting active lifestyles. Their guts became enormous fermentation chambers where complex communities of microorganisms worked around the clock to break down tough plant fibers into usable nutrients. But here's what makes these creatures truly remarkable. They weren't just scaled-up versions of smaller animals struggling to cope with the challenges of enormous size. They were perfectly adapted giants that had solved every engineering problem associated with terrestrial gigantism. Their necks could move with surprising grace despite their incredible length. Their limbs could support their massive bodies while allowing for surprisingly agile locomotion. Their sensory systems remained acute despite the challenges of coordinating such enormous forms. The ecological impact of these giants was transformative. Their feeding activities created entirely new types of environmental disturbance that shaped plant communities across vast landscapes. They could strip all vegetation from trees at heights of 20 meters or more, creating browsing pressure that no terrestrial ecosystem had ever experienced before. This intense selective pressure drove rapid evolution among plant communities, favoring species that could either grow taller than the giants could reach or reproduce quickly enough to recover from severe browsing damage. The social behaviors of these massive herbivores were equally impressive. Despite their enormous size, many could number in the hundreds. The species lived in herds that coordination required to move such groups across landscapes without causing mutual harm, demanded sophisticated communication systems and social structures. These animals developed low-frequency vocalizations that could travel for miles, allowing herd members to maintain contact even when separated by considerable distances. The migration patterns of these herds created some of the most spectacular wildlife phenomena in Earth's history. Imagine thousands of creatures the size of small buildings moving across continents in search of seasonal feeding grounds. The environmental impact of such migrations would have been visible from space, creating temporary rivers of moving giants that altered landscapes wherever they passed. The predators that evolved to hunt these giants were equally extraordinary. Taking down prey that weighed 50 tons or more required hunting strategies and anatomical adaptations that pushed predatory evolution to its absolute limits. Some predatory lineages developed pack-hunting behaviors of incredible sophistication, with groups of a dozen or more individuals coordinating complex attacks that could bring down even the largest herbivores. These pack hunters developed communication systems that allowed them to coordinate attacks with military precision. Different individuals would take on specialized roles during hunts. Some would act as scouts to locate and assess potential prey. Others would serve as drivers to separate individuals from protective herder killings, and still others would deliver attacks once prey had been isolated and weakened. The anatomical adaptations of these apex predators were equally impressive. Some species developed skulls over 6 feet long, filled with teeth the size of railroad spikes. Their jaw muscles were so powerful that their bite force exceeded that of any predator that has ever existed. Their claws grew to lengths that would make modern sword blades seem modest by comparison. But size and strength weren't the only weapons in their predatory arsenal. Many of these hunters developed incredible speed and agility that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. They could accelerate from standing starts to speeds that would allow them to run down even the fastest prey. Their turning ability and maneuverability were so advanced that they could change direction instantaneously during high-speed pursuits. The hunting strategies employed by these predators were as varied as they were effective. Some species became ambush specialists, using their intelligence and patience to set traps for unsuspecting herbivores. They would position themselves along game trails or near water sources, waiting motionless for hours until the perfect opportunity presented itself. Others became pursuit predators that could run down prey across vast distances. These marathon hunters had cardiovascular systems that could sustain high activity levels for extended periods, allowing them to exhaust prey through persistence rather than raw speed. Their hunting techniques resembled those of modern wolves, but scaled up to proportions that seem almost mythical. Still, other predatory species developed specialized techniques for hunting particular types of prey. Some evolved specifically to hunt the giant herbivores, developing anatomical and behavioral adaptations that made them supremely effective against massive but relatively slow-moving targets. Others specialized in hunting smaller, more agile prey, maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary to catch fast-moving herbivores. The arms race between these predators and their prey drove evolutionary innovation at rates that were unprecedented in terrestrial ecosystems. Herbivores developed increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies to counter predatory threats. Some species evolved armor plating that could deflect even the most powerful attacks. Others developed defensive behaviors and social structures that provided protection through group vigilance and mutual defense. The Triassic period stands as perhaps the most extraordinary chapter in our planet's 4-billion-year story. From the ashes of the worst catastrophe Earth had ever endured emerged a world more magnificent, more diverse, and more innovative than anything that had existed before. The survivors didn't just rebuild civilization, they revolutionized it entirely. The small, scrappy dinosaurs that had lived in the shadows became the architects of ecosystems that would dominate our planet for the next 165 million years. The bizarre marine reptiles pioneered approaches to aquatic life that had never been attempted. The first mammals, pterosaurs, and modern coral reefs all emerged from this crucible of innovation. What began as a post-apocalyptic wasteland became the foundation for biological diversity that continues to inspire us today. The Triassic proved something profound about life itself, that catastrophe isn't just destructive, it's creative. It showed us that even when faced with seemingly impossible odds, life